If you ever have a roof that you need to shingle that butts up against a wall, like this one does over here, then I'm going to show you how you can get that job done in a way that's 100% guaranteed waterproof and that looks great as well. We're doing it right now, so it's a perfect time to demonstrate. So we've started off this job with this aluminum flashing here. We've got this strip of flashing that has 5 inches extending up the vertical and 7 inches extending down the roof. This part of the roof is known as the shed roof, where there's a slope down in this direction, but there's no peak to this part of the roof. There's a peak to this part of the roof, and I'll get to that in a minute. But the first step is to shingle most of the way up your shed roof section, and then to put a strip of flashing of about this dimension and bent to the correct angle. You can get that done with a flashing brake, which is a machine to bend strips of aluminum like this. You can have people do it for you, or you can rent a flashing brake and just buy the flat stock aluminum. Either way, you got to get that flashing, cut it to the right length, and then nestle it into that upper corner on top of your second last layer of roof shingles. That's when you can get ready for the final layer of roof shingles, which is this layer here, which will go on top of the flashing, butted up against where your roof meets your wall. Now, a couple of things about that. First of all, you're not going to be able to drive nails through this last layer of shingles because, of course, the nails would be on top, they'd be exposed, and that would affect your waterproofness. So this last layer of shingles that goes on top of the flashing, you can only fasten down with roofing tar or roofing caulking. Secondly, you don't want to install this last layer of narrow shingles on top of this flashing on the shed roof section right away, because this flashing has to tie in with a slightly different sort of flashing up here on this part of the roof. This is where the gable meets the shed roof. We have a valley. And not every roof that butts up against a wall of a taller section of building is going to be like this. This is a kind of a more complex one than average. Sometimes you might just have a shed roof over top of a deck butting up against the wall, and there's no peaks or valleys involved. But if you ever do have to deal with a peak or valley situation, it's important to do it right, and it's easy to do it wrong. So the trick here is that you have to use something called step flashing on this sloped section. This is what step flashing looks like. It's custom bent from the same flat stock aluminum using the same machine, a flashing brake it's called. But my friend Brad and I, who's filming for me right now, have been cutting these to length, about 13 inches long in this case, which is the length that's equal to the width of our roofing shingles. Now the reason we're doing this, rather than going with just a continuous long strip like we did on the shed roof section, is because over here, it's more important to weave the roof shingles in with this step flashing. It creates a much more waterproof layer. So we've already started to do that here. We brought the continuous piece of flashing on this section up a little ways, bent it up a little ways onto the sloped section of roof here, the gable. And then we started putting step flashing on top of that, starting at the bottom and going up, just like you do with roofing shingles. Only we're alternating a piece of step flashing and a roofing shingle and repeating that pattern as we go up. And I'll show you how that works. Of course, you got to have some of your roofing shingles up on the roof with you, ready to go. Right now, we've got step flashing and shingle on top. So to continue the pattern correctly to shed water, we need to put another piece of step flashing next. So you're going to put it right in here like this. With these layered shingles, this is the area where we will see, and this top area down here is where we won't see. So we're going to bring that step flashing just shy of the area where we'll start to see it, because we don't want the flashing to be visible. And the important thing is to tuck it right in tightly to the corner between roof and wall. Now, it doesn't have to stay there just yet, because before we fasten anything, we actually have to cut this next piece of shingle to length. And we do that by butting it tightly up against the wall and using the adjacent shingle and a pair of tin snips to mark it. You're going to take the tin snips, make sure the shingle is butted tight against the wall, like I said, and make just a little snip where this new shingle will butt up against the adjacent one, the neighboring one. Then we'll take an Olfa utility knife. These, in my experience, are the best way to cut these roofing shingles. And I've got a little scrap of plywood up here to act as a backing for cutting through these shingles so that we don't end up cutting into the roof. I'll just find my little slit, and there it is there that I just made. Take a framing square here. This is another tool that you're going to need. Line it up on top. Get it square. And line up the bottom end of that square with my little slit. Once it's in place, just going to hold that square tightly against the shingle and repeatedly score the shingle. You'll notice I'm scoring the back face. That's because it's a lot easier on your knife blade to do it from the back outwards rather than from the front. Shingles like this, they have a lot of grit and gravel in them, and that'll just destroy your blade in a few strokes. So this way, it cuts relatively easily, and the knife blade is still going to be good for a while yet. So that gives us the shingle we need for this next layer. Just going to get this scrap plywood out of the way. And once again, before we fasten this shingle, we've got to get our step flashing in position here. Tight up against that corner and low enough that it's almost going to be visible in the exposed area of roof shingle on this next course, but it won't quite be visible. With that in place, we'll put our shingle on top of the step flashing, and we'll get it to the right height here so it matches its neighboring shingle, which is this one here. And with that in place, and we're making double sure that that piece of step flashing is right in tight to the wall, because there's no do-overs with this, at least not easily. And with that ready, I'll get 3 roofing nails. These are just your regular large-headed roofing nails out of my pouch. And my hammer. And I'll start with the nail that's going to go here, securing the step flashing. Now I'm not going to go right into the corner with this nail, because the corner is kind of the most important place to maintain integrity for waterproofing. So I'm going to go a couple inches out from that corner to maintain that integrity of the flashing, but still I'll be going through the flashing so that it's going to be secured down to the roof. So that's one nail in place. I'm going to go ahead and fasten the other end of this latest shingle now. And one more in the middle should do it. This isn't a full-length shingle. Normally you'd use 5 nails or so for these particular shingles, which are about 38 inches long each, I think, if they haven't been cut. And we'll do one more nail up towards the top of this latest piece of step flashing, because otherwise there would only be the one nail holding this piece of step flashing. And as we do that, we're going to, again, make sure that that step flashing is right in tight to that corner. That's key. Get our nail positioned. Step flashing is firmly in place. And that's the next layer of step flashing done. So from there, all you have to do is repeat that same pattern. It's really not rocket science. We're going to take another piece of step flashing. It's going to be installed here over top of the shingle step flashing sandwich that we just made. And then we're going to put another shingle, which will be custom cut to length, over top of both step flashing and that shingle we just installed. We'll continue that pattern until we reach the peak of the roof right here. And then we'll stop the step flashing at the peak of the roof, and we will repeat the entire procedure from the other side. So down here, we've got some shingles laying there at the moment just loosely, but you can see down there we have our continuous piece of flashing already installed on the flat shed roof section, and we're going to continue that step flashing, as I said, up this adjacent side, the other side of the gable area of roof. And then I'll show you how we'll finish off the job with flashing at the very peak, which is a little trickier. But that is the basics of the first and really most important part of this process. One more thing I forgot to mention before we move on. You'll notice that the step flashing that is now woven into these shingles is still visible as it goes up the wall. Now that's not waterproof the way it is now, and it has to change if it's going to be waterproof, because obviously if there was a driving rain coming in and hitting this wall, it could get behind this step flashing and ultimately leak down into this addition we put on the back of the house. So that's why when we finish all the step flashing and shingle weaving, we're going to be cutting some more pieces of this gray dimpled plastic wrap, which is called Delta Dry. This creates a drainage layer behind the cedar shingle siding I'm going to be installing. And we're going to be weaving that Delta Dry, the additional pieces of Delta Dry, into the existing Delta Dry here, and coming down over top of the step flashing here, butting that gray dimpled wrap down tight to the roof shingles, and then the cedar shingle siding is going to come down above that. So the step flashing should not be visible when the installation's done, and it's not going to be visible on this job here. I just wanted to mention that because I forgot to mention it before. And if you leave your job like this, well, it's not going to keep the water out. So moving on, I thought I'd show you what the step flashing looks like before you cut it into steps. As I said, this is just aluminum flat stock meant to be bent into flashing. In this case, it's bent to 90 degrees because this roof butting up against the wall is 90 degrees. And matching it to the width of these roofing shingles is the name of the game here. Now that distance happens to be about 13 inches, 13 and a quarter, I think, actually. So I'm just going to go ahead and cut one here and show you how easy this is. It doesn't have to be perfectly precise. Just hook my tape measure on it here, make a little snip at 13 and a quarter inches, and then just carefully snip the rest of the way through it with our trusty pin snips. Now again, it's not crucial that this be a perfectly square cut. It's also not crucial that it be exactly 13 and a quarter inches, because you have some adjustment, quite a bit of adjustment actually, in how much overlap the step flashing has over the shingle underneath it. But you just cut from one side, flip it over, and cut from the other side. It's a lot easier that way. And there you have it. So we just got to cut a few more of these and we'll have enough step flashing to finish the other side of this roof. And then to finish up, as I said, I'll show you how we flash the peak of the roof. So we've just finished step flashing and shingling up to the peak here, as you can see, and we're getting ready to do that last little tricky bit I mentioned before at the peak, because obviously the pattern is broken when you reach the peak. Those two sides of the gable come together, and you can't just continue with step flashing over the peak in the normal way. So that's why I'm going to modify this piece of step flashing here by cutting partway along it down to the seam in the middle, right here like this, with the tin snips. And you'll see what I'm doing in a minute. So you can see that's cut down to the corner, and now I can actually place it down here over the peak and bend it so that it goes over top of the peak nice and neatly like this. Now you can see here there is a problem though, because of this particular roof being close under this octagonal window. Our step flashing needs to be trimmed. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. I'm going to just continue that bend a little bit with my fingers first. And I'm going to get my pencil and mark where that trimming needs to happen. And again, this doesn't have to be perfect. It's not a dovetail box. But now we can snip off this little bit of unnecessary material. Maybe even a little bit more than that. And we'll see how that fits now. Looks like it's a perfect fit. So the next step is going to be to install this shingle here and continue the pattern. So like I said, we're going to go ahead and nail this last shingle, well, not quite the last shingle, but one of the last shingles from this side of the roof now, over top of our custom bent piece of step flashing. I'll call it the cap flashing, if you will. Once again, we'll tuck that flashing in there, nice and snug, and position the shingle right up against the wall, just like with the previous layers. Get it to the right altitude here, and nail it. Oh, that's actually not quite tight in there. You always want to make sure the flashing is nice and tight into the wall. And now we'll drive our first nail here. Do another one over here on the other side. I always like to nail one end of the shingle and then the other, and then fill in the nails in the middle. Keeps it a little more secure that way. We'll do 5, seeing as this is a full-length shingle. And then we'll tack down this top edge, because we're now, of course, bridging over the peak. Now we'll go ahead and install one of the last shingles here on this side. And this is going to work much the same. Just get the position right. And we have one more little short piece to tuck in here against the wall and against our flashing. And once again, you notice I didn't nail this last nail. I didn't drive it right in against the wall because we want to maintain the integrity of that flashing at the vertice. And we're almost done now. Just gonna again tack down this final shingle we just fastened over the top here. You want to make sure that this top shingle rounds the bend as tightly as possible. You don't want a bubble or a gap underneath it. And we're pretty much done now, except for one final step. Of course, we haven't yet installed the cap shingles or ridge shingles on top, but that's pretty easy to do. If you know anything at all about roofing, you'll know how to do that. So I'm not going to show that on this video. But what I am going to show is how we fix this problem down here. That custom piece of step flashing that we made up has a weak point here. You see there's a V-shaped notch where technically driving rain could still get in there, and we're still vulnerable in this particular spot. So that's why I've cut this custom rectangular piece of flashing as the final piece of flashing we're going to install before we cover all this flashing with building wrap and with siding, which, as I mentioned earlier, is a very necessary step for waterproofing. I'm going to use this roofing tar. Oh, a little bit windy up here. And basically just plug this V-shaped gap with tar and with this rectangular piece here. So we'll just apply some of this to the back, quite a generous layer to fill any gaps in case this little rectangle of flashing doesn't want to sit totally flat for us. Pretty much impossible to avoid getting some of this on your fingers with this sort of thing. Just don't wear a white shirt while doing this. There, that's a pretty well covered piece there. And we'll just massage this into place, doing our best to split the difference. And there, that's bonding really well already, I can tell. It's squeezing out a little bit on the sides. I'm not sure if you can see that. But that's also going to squeeze down to that point at the bottom of the V, our most vulnerable spot right there, and waterproof that. And that's about it. As I said, we're condensing the video. We're skipping a few steps, like installing those cap shingles over top, but that's just normal standard roofing stuff. And again, very crucial that after doing the work we've shown you here, that you come down over top of this flashing, the step flashing and the strip flashing down on the shed roof with building wrap and with siding. To shed water properly, building wrap and siding have to be on top of the flashing. But again, we'll maybe show that in a different video. I think you understand the concept. So that's the best way that I know of to flash a roof and weave the flashing in with the shingles as you butt the roof against the wall of a different section of the building. So thanks for watching. Like, share, subscribe, and we'll catch you next time on Cabin in the Woods.